Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for another serial killer spotlight, where this month we'll be focusing on the story of Ed Kemper, sometimes known as the co-ed killer. He is known to have murdered 10 people in total, including his own mother and grandparents, his crimes spanning from 1964 to 1973 when he was finally apprehended. Ed Kemper is a particularly interesting serial killer to look at because he always spoke so openly of his crimes, and he is incredibly self-aware. When he speaks, it's almost like he's psychoanalyzing himself. It makes for a really interesting study. Throughout this video I'll be including my own storytelling as usual, but also including clips of Ed telling the story from his own perspective. But let's begin with his early life, as I always do. So Edmund Emil Kemper III was born 18th December 1948 in Burbank, California. He was named after his father and grandfather before him. His parents were Clarnell Kemper and Edmund Kemper II. He was the middle child with two sisters, Susan and Alan. And he was a big baby. Ed was 13 pounds when he was born, and he will continue on to be a big human. He grew to be 6'9" tall, and at the height of his crimes he weighed 300 pounds. This was not the type of man that you wanted to run into in a dark alley. Just his appearance was intimidating. And throughout his childhood he was always the odd one out because of his height. By the age of 4 he was already a head taller than his classmates, and he had the nickname of Guy. Most of his family called him Guy and still do today. Ed was close to his father when he was young. He idolised him, but Edmund II and Clarnell divorced in 1957 when Ed was just 9 years old, and Clarnell moves with her children to Helena, Montana. Now Ed was really close with his father, and this was a really hard time in his life, having to move away from him. But this was also a hard time for Clarnell, who reportedly hated being reminded so much of her ex-husband by her son, who looked just like him. And she wasn't exactly the nicest to her son. She would constantly ridicule him for his size and personality, and she constantly drank. She was an alcoholic. But it could be worth bearing in mind throughout this video that the majority of what we know about Kemper, about his childhood and his personal life, comes straight from him, comes straight from the horse's mouth. And he has given multiple different versions of the same stories throughout his incarceration, so it's hard to know exactly what the truth is. But I think we can know for certain that Clarnell wasn't exactly the best mother to Ed.
My mother was a sick, angry, hungry, and very sad woman. I hated her, but I wanted to love my mother. And I watched the alcohol increase, I watched her social life drop off, I watched her get bizarre. She had terrible pain from her life, earlier life, her upbringing, a failed marriage with my father. I'm a constant reminder of that failure. I hate to distill it down into such, into one-word realities like that. There's a lot that leads into that happening, but that is what happened. They represented not what my mother was, but what she liked, what she coveted, what was important to her.
As a boy, Ed would play unusual games with his sisters, some of his personal favourites being called electric chair and gas chamber. He would have his sisters strap him to a chair and he would make them pretend to flip an imaginary switch, and then he would pretend to be electrocuted and die. He would also cut off the heads and limbs of his sisters' dolls, which in hindsight, knowing that he would turn out to be a serial killer, is just very foreboding. But I think in general that's just quite a standard annoying brother thing to do.
My younger sister's 2 years younger, and I developed some morbid games. My life had started going that way at about 8.
And what were those games that you played with your sister?
Okay. Well, the one I remember someone talking about in a book was one that was playing gas chamber or electric chair or something. And we had this big old overstuffed chair up in my room. And it was not just my sister and I, it was my sister and I and a friend, a close friend. We got into all these games. We got into one game where we'd roll up in a rug and the person would try to get out of it. It was just like a large throw rug. And it was, I guess, what fascinated us individually about it is it was a completely, it broke up the monotony, I guess, of what we were doing. Didn't have a lot of toys to play with. We got bored with those pretty quickly. So we looked for things to do. You roll up in the rug and you try to get out, and the other two would leave the room and we see who could get out fastest. You know, you try to work your way out sideways or scoot out the end of it or whatever. And went from that to being tied in this overstuffed chair.
Gradually, Ed begins to distance himself from his sisters. He starts to have these depraved fantasies, a deep, desperate secret that he kept from everyone. At the age of 10, he kills his family's cat, burying it alive in the garden before digging it up to make sure it was dead. It was, so he removes the cat's head and examines its body. At 13, he kills the family's second cat with a machete when it started to show that it favoured his sister over him. This time, Ed actually stored the body in his closet in his bedroom, which his mother later found. I mean, imagine the smell, of course she's going to find it. This is textbook serial killer. You start off with murdering animals, and then you move on to humans. Around this same time, he begins to develop a crush on one of his teachers, and he confesses this to one of his sisters. Of course, his sister makes fun of him a bit for this, and tells him that he should try and kiss the teacher, see what she does. Ed, around 12-13 years old, replies that he couldn't kiss his teacher. He'd have to kill her first. His mother would force him to sleep in the basement, locking him in the dark with the rats every single night. Apparently, she was scared that he was going to rape his sisters in the middle of the night. Now, is this something that she simply projected onto him, or did she have legitimate reasons for thinking he might do this? That's something that we'll never truly know the answer to.
At a certain time of the evening, the family left the center room, the living room of the house. My mother and my sisters, or my sisters themselves, would go up to bed upstairs, where I used to go to bed, upstairs. I had to go down to the basement. And an 8-year-old child had a tough time differentiating the reason in that. Why am I going to the basement? I'm going to hell, they're going to heaven.
By the time he was 15, Ed had had enough. He decides to run away to live with his father, hitchhiking to his father's home in Los Angeles. But their reunion wasn't exactly everything that Ed had hoped for. His father had remarried and had this new family. He had this wife and a stepson, and Ed was no longer a part of it. He stays out with his father for 1 month, but he constantly acts out. He's hostile and aggressive, and so they send him back to live with Clarnell, but Clarnell didn't want him back. She was quite happy whilst he was gone. She didn't like her son. And so Ed is sent to live with his paternal grandparents, something that would prove to be a fatal decision. His grandparents were Maud and the original Edmund Kemper, Edmund Kemper I, and they lived on a secluded farm in the mountains of North Fork in California. Ed wasn't exactly happy about this arrangement. He felt abandoned. He felt like his family were shunning him from one family member to another. He later described himself at this time in his life as a walking time bomb. Only this time bomb was 15 years old and already 6'4". Although Maud never treated Ed as badly as he would say his mother did, she was similar enough to his mother that it just incited these same feelings of rage. Ed was fed up of the women in his life controlling him, telling him what to do, emasculating him, and he would have fantasies about harming them. He had this real issue with female authority figures. But whilst living at the farm, Ed did have relative freedom compared to living with his mother. He wasn't locked in the basement to sleep every night, for one thing. And he did really seem to get on well with his grandfather, who gave him a rifle and taught him how to shoot guns, how to hunt. Ed would spend all his days out in the 17-acre farm and would shoot at animals, usually birds. This is something that his grandmother really hated him doing, and eventually she confiscates the rifle from him. This was August 1964, and Ed had reached a breaking point. He hated how his grandmother treated both him and his grandfather, who was beginning to show the early signs of dementia. He hated how much Maud reminded him of Clarnell. On August 27th, Ed and Maud begin to argue over his killing of birds, and Ed just snaps. He was fed up, he leaves the room, he gets his rifle, and he returns, shooting Maud once in the back of the head and twice in the back. She didn't even see him coming, a small mercy for Maud, who would never know that her grandson had murdered her. She died instantly. Some reports state that he also grabbed a knife and stabbed her multiple times, but I'm not entirely convinced that happened. He would later say that he killed her just to see what it felt like, but it was more likely that this was just a result of his rage. He just snapped. But now Ed has an issue. He doesn't want his grandfather, the closest he's ever really felt to love, to see that his wife was dead. Ed drags his grandmother's body into the bedroom and waits for his grandfather's truck to pull up in the driveway. When he does, he immediately shoots his grandfather a single time in the head, leaving him to bleed to death in the driveway before dragging him into the garage. In Ed's head, he viewed this as a mercy to his grandfather, who was getting more ill with dementia as time went on, and it meant that he wasn't going to have to live life without his wife. And it's not exactly like Ed killed his grandfather to cover his own back in any way so he could escape being arrested, no witnesses at the scene. Ed actually immediately calls his mother in Montana and tells her what he's done, and Clarnell just says to him, "You're stupid, call the police," which he does. When the police arrive, Ed's waiting calmly on the porch for them and they take him straight into custody. He doesn't fight or argue, he just goes with them. He never denies what he did and he later just talks openly with interviewers about it. Authorities in California couldn't quite comprehend that a 15-year-old was capable of such horrific crimes. Even a 15-year-old who was as tall and as huge and very adult-seeming as Ed Kemper. On a judge's order, he's sent for psychiatric testing and is diagnosed as having paranoid schizophrenia. As a result of his diagnosis, instead of being sent to the local juvenile prison, he's sent to the Atascadero State Hospital for the Criminally Insane. Atascadero was the home to a lot of severely mentally ill people, some of whom had committed serious crimes, just like Ed. Authorities kind of just assumed that Ed Kemper was insane. They probably just wanted him to be a paranoid schizophrenic because of course he had to be. Look at what he did. He killed his own grandparents. I think he scared people because even then he was so smart, he was so self-aware. The longer he spent in hospital, the more doctors began to question his diagnosis of schizophrenia. He just didn't have the signs, he was too smart, too organised. So he's re-diagnosed with a passive-aggressive type personality trait disturbance, a big step down in diagnosis and a far cry from insanity. Whilst Ed was in Atascadero, he really was the model prisoner. He flourished in this structured environment and he showed huge amounts of intelligence. They tested his IQ twice whilst he was in there. His first score came in at 136 and his second came in at 145. The average American IQ is between 90 and 100. 145 and over is considered to be full-blown genius. I even found an article on the NZ Herald that included an interview with Ed's younger half-brother, who claimed that Ed even faked his IQ test back then, so his score would have come out even lower than they should have been. His brother claims that his IQ was more likely 180 plus. Only 1% of the world have an IQ of 136 or above. Doctors really truly believed that Ed could be rehabilitated whilst at Atascadero, that he could go on to be a functioning member of society. He was smart, helpful and willing to learn. But what they didn't realise was that Ed was intelligent enough to know that he just had to act like he'd been rehabilitated. They didn't realise that he was still having these same dark fantasies that he'd always had. He just knew better than to share them with the world, share them with his psychiatrist. As time goes on, he's given more and more responsibilities within the hospital, moving test equipment from room to room and even eventually beginning to assist doctors in administering psychiatric evaluations to other patients, during which he learnt the right and wrong answers to 28 different assessments. He knew exactly what he would need to say eventually to convince the doctors to release him. But he wasn't only learning things from the doctors, he was also learning things from his fellow prisoners, sex offenders and murderers. He learned that the best way to avoid capture after raping a woman was to kill her. He learned how to gain a woman's trust with words, how to come across as the good guy, the nice guy. On his 21st birthday, the 18th of December 1969, Ed Kemper is released from Atascadero on parole. At this point, he spent over 5 years in a psychiatric hospital. His teenage years when he should have been out learning how to function in society, learning how to talk to girls, learning independence, he was alone in this hospital. And don't misunderstand, he was 100% right to be in hospital for his crimes, but he missed up on a lot of regular growing up whilst he was in there. He spent these formative puberty years in a place where sex and violence were inextricably woven. He was 15 years old and hearing other men in the hospital talk about violence and murder in relation to sex. This would have had an impact on his psyche. On his release, his psychiatrist strongly recommended that he does not move back in with his mother, who was the apparent cause of all of his problems. So the California State Authority make the decision to send him back to live with his mother. Of course, he didn't have any means to live alone, he had no money or job prospects, he had no life skills really, although he was very intelligent. They had no other choice, they said. Whilst Ed was in hospital, Clarnell had actually moved to California just outside of Santa Cruz, and she started a job as an administrator at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And then Ed just comes barreling back into her life, and it doesn't take long for their relationship to get back to how it always was. Bad. She continues to overpower and emasculate him, and he feels like he's a child again, trapped in that dark basement with the rats. Ed never had the usual experiences with girls that most teenage boys would have had, and when he's let out of hospital, he's way behind all of his peers. When he would try and talk about girls to Clarnell, she would tell him that he was too ugly to ever get a girlfriend, that no one would ever love him. He had no idea how to communicate with the opposite sex, and so he starts picking up hitchhikers. This is an era in which hitchhiking is a common thing for people to do, especially for young university students in the area in which Ed now lived. He craved that human connection and that control. Now we'll be circling back around to this in a bit, but first I just want to focus on the other aspects of his life outside the hospital, but we will get back to the hitchhiking. Another condition of Ed's parole was that he was required to participate in secondary education, so he enrolls at the local community college and begins taking criminology courses out of everything he could choose. He had decided whilst he was in hospital that he wanted to work in law enforcement, and he set his sights on becoming a police officer. Now, he wasn't concerned about his criminal record of double homicide getting in the way of this, as he was working on getting his juvenile records permanently expunged, something that he did actually succeed in doing in November 1972. His probation psychiatrist is incredibly happy with the progress Ed makes. A direct quote from his psychiatrist reads, "If I were to see this patient without having any history available or getting any history from him, I would think that we're dealing with a very well-adjusted young man who had initiative, intelligence, and who was free of any psychiatric illness. It is my opinion that he has made a very excellent response to the years of treatment and rehabilitation, and I would see no psychiatric reason to consider him to be any danger to himself or any member of society." Now this just shows how good Ed was at pretending, how good an act he put on. Even a professional considered him to be a perfectly sane, functioning member of society. Whilst in Ed's head, he was actually living in a world where he fantasised about rape and murder. He was just constantly in this imaginary world where he was hurting females left, right and centre.
You were able to appear like an ordinary person, non-threatening to...
I lived as an ordinary person most of my life, even though I was living a parallel and increasingly sick life, other life. One victim let me back in the car. I locked myself out. She opened the door for me. My gun was under the seat. What in the hell am I doing telling you that? Am I a masochist? Am I looking to be tormented further? I'm trying to show you just how awful this got, how commanding these rages got. I was raging inside. There was just incredible energies, positive and negative, depending on a mood. That would trigger one or the other. And outside, I looked troubled at times. Other times, I looked moody. Other times, perfectly serene. Not very sane.
Eventually, Ed learns at 6'9" tall, he was too tall to be in the police, and so his dreams are ruined forever. I find it to be a flaw in the system that the fact that he was a murderer doesn't disqualify him, but the fact that he's tall does. So in consolation, he takes to hanging out at a local police bar called the Jury Room, where he befriends many of the police officers in the area. They didn't know his past, and they thought of him as a gentle giant, polite and friendly and very intelligent. They called him Big Ed. Big Ed would go to the jury room night after night and listen to the police's stories.
They'd buy me a beer, I'd buy them a beer. Casual relationships, but I was poking around a little bit trying to find some things out. I knew they wouldn't be privy to hot information, but there were some things that were bothering me, like were there any speculations on how they were dying.
Did the cops like you?
Like I said, a friendly nuisance. I got in the way, and it was deliberate. Again, friendly nuisances are dismissed.
How did you get the knowledge to outsmart the police?
Watching television, believe it or not. Joseph Wambaugh, police story. Got some tremendous insights into not just the gimmicks, the actual things, the tidbits that you would pick up from their procedures, but the mechanics behind that, the logic behind it.
He jumps between several different jobs before eventually ending up at the California Highway Department, and he saves enough money to move out of his mother's house. He heads north to Alameda near San Francisco and shares an apartment with a friend, but he jumps back and forth, moving back in with his mother in times when he had little money, and she did always accept him back. But when he was in Alameda, his mother would randomly turn up to check on him and she would phone him constantly. To many, this may seem like a regular motherly thing to do, but Clarnell was nothing short of just domineering. It wasn't wanting to check in on her lovely son, it was wanting to control his life. Ed felt like he would never be able to escape her, and their arguments continued throughout this time. Ed said that they always argued over stupid things, it was never anything serious, but they would get into these huge screaming matches over nothing. Ed's relationship with his mother had tainted his entire view of females. He was afraid of them, and he hated them. Although he desperately craved that companionship, a normal relationship, he didn't know how to make that possible, because the truth of it was that he just resented all women. He felt awkward around them, he didn't know how to make conversation, and this made him really angry.
Why did you actually kill the girls?
My frustration, my inability to communicate socially, sexually. I wasn't impotent, but emotionally I was impotent. I was scared to death of failing in male-female relationships. I knew absolutely nothing about that whole area, even if just sitting down and talking with a young lady. I need to be able to really communicate, and ironically enough, that's why I began picking people up. And I'm picking up young women, and I'm going a little bit farther each time. It's a daring kind of a thing. At first there wasn't a gun. I'm driving along. We go to a vulnerable place where there aren't people watching, where I could act out, and I say, no, I can't. And then a gun is in the car, hidden. And this craving, this awful, raging, eating feeling inside. I could feel it consuming my insides, this fantastic passion.
But he did actually manage to hold down one long-term relationship once he moved to Alameda away from his mother. He was in his early 20s at this point, and he begins dating a 16-year-old girl, and they eventually become engaged. But unsurprisingly, Clarnell hated this girl, whose name has largely been kept out of the media, and eventually the couple actually part. Some reports say they parted because Clarnell hated her so much. Whilst in Alameda, Ed purchased a motorcycle, but he got into two separate accidents pretty quickly, in one of which he was hit by a car, leading to a badly injured arm. He was rewarded a $15,000 settlement in a civil lawsuit, which he would use to buy a 1969 yellow Ford Galaxy. It's whilst he was out driving this car that he noticed the number of young hitchhikers along the side of the roads. If you were a university student in California at the time, the number one form of transport was hitchhiking, thumbing for lifts off random people. Whilst nowadays it seems like something most people wouldn't dare do, it was very normal at the time. And so Ed begins. At first, Ed would simply just practice by picking up young female hitchhikers. And he would just pick them up, take them to wherever they wanted to go, and just let them go. But this was all part of a larger plan. He says over the next few months he picked up over 150 female hitchhikers, practicing his social skills on them, figuring out how to make them feel comfortable in his car, how to make them trust him. His brain categorized everything they did, every small interaction, their reactions to things he said, their strengths and weaknesses. He paid attention to everything. He tried to make them feel as comfortable and at ease as he could. Something which I'm sure wouldn't have been easy. I mean, a 6'9", 300-pound man would intimidate a lot of people, I'm sure. As he gets more comfortable with picking up hitchhikers, he begins to store tools in his car, should the need to use them ever come over him. He had plastic bags, knives, blankets, and handcuffs. And eventually he starts keeping a gun under the driver's seat to prove to himself that nobody would know there was there until it was too late. He practiced how he could get the passenger side door to lock from the inside by reaching over his passenger towards the door, saying that the door was a little bit stiff, and then he'd drop a chapstick down behind the handle so they couldn't open it from the inside. As a result, these girls could only get out the car if Ed let himself out the car and opened it from the outside for them. These girls were completely at his mercy. He was methodical, he was planned. He called his homicidal sexual urges his little zapples. He had a name for them, and he knew that eventually he was going to have to act on them. But for now, he's daring himself. He's picking up young women, he's going a little bit further each time, knowing that he has the option to hurt them. He never gives in. But on the 7th of May 1972, Ed has a huge fight with his mother over the phone and sets out once again to pick up some hitchhikers. But this time he knows it's no longer a practice. He sets out to murder. He later said, "I had full intentions of killing them. I would have loved to have raped them, but not having any experience at all." And then he just trails off. 18-year-old Marianne Pesky and Anita Lucchesa attended Fresno State University together. On May 7th, they decided that they were going to hitchhike to Stanford University in Palo Alto, just south of San Francisco. They never arrived there. Ed Kemper had been the one to pick them up, and they were very grateful when Ed said that he'd be happy to take them all the way to Stanford, over an hour's drive away. But they soon begin to realise that something was wrong when Ed drives off the highway, stopping on a dirt road. He tells them outright that he intended to rape them. To calm them down, he promises that they will be fine if they follow his demands. So they comply. He brings out his tools for the first time, handcuffing Marianne to the back seat and forcing Anita into the boot of the car. He tries to smother Marianne before stabbing her, but she's putting up one hell of a fight. She bit through the bag that he placed over her head to suffocate her. Eventually, he slits her throat and kills her before doing the same to Anita, who was still in the boot throughout all of this. He puts both corpses in the boot and drives back to Alameda. On the journey back home, he actually is stopped by an officer for a broken taillight, a taillight that Anita probably broke in the struggle. Had the officer opened the boot, Ed would have been caught there and then, although he says that he would have just killed the officer on the spot and gone on his way. In Alameda, his roommate was out, so he brings the bodies into the apartment. I'm going to save you the graphic details of what he did to them there. If you want the information, it's easy to find on the internet. I just don't think it's necessary for me to detail it all here. In a nutshell, he just photographs them, severs body parts, and engages in sexual acts with the parts. He buries most of Marianne in a shallow grave in the mountains and uses her severed head for sexual gratification before tossing it into a ravine alongside Anita's. He scatters the remains over the mountain to minimise the chances of them being found. And then he goes back to his usual routine of picking up girls and taking them safely to their destinations. He enjoyed having this power, knowing that as soon as they placed their hand on his car handle, he was in control of whether they lived or they died. Of course, missing persons reports are filed for both Marianne and Anita when they fail to arrive at Stanford, but the police don't really do anything. They were probably just runaways after all. But it was August when Marianne's skull is found up on Loma Prieta Mountain in Santa Cruz County, identified through dental records. Almost a month after the skull was found, on October 14th, 15-year-old dance student Aiko Koo disappears whilst hitchhiking from Berkeley. She'd missed the bus to a dance class and had no means of letting anyone know, so hitchhiking was her only option. Ed was more than happy to oblige, and she gets into his car. But Ed had learned from his last murders that he couldn't let things get out of control for him. It ruined the fantasy. He drives Aiko to a remote location and explains to her that she's being kidnapped, and of course, she becomes hysterical. But Ed had been practicing for months. He knew how to manipulate and control with his words, so he explains that he wanted to kill himself and take her with him. He was very depressed and suicidal, and he didn't want to die alone. But Aiko had made him see that he did want to live. He just wanted to talk to her for a while, he says. She eventually calms down and tries to talk him out of suicide, saying that he has so much to live for and all that kind of thing. But then Ed makes a big mistake. He accidentally locks himself out of his own car, leaving his gun and tools inside with Aiko. But somehow he manages to persuade Aiko into opening the door for him. I think that gives you a really good understanding of how charismatic Ed Kemper really was. And then he kills her. He first pinches her nostrils until she blacks out before strangling her with her own scarf. He puts her in the boot and then stops at a bar on the way home for a few drinks. He does the same to Aiko that he did to Marianne and Anita, dismembering her body and disposing of the remains.
The first time, okay? The two girls were killed around 6 p.m. By 11 the next morning, they are both completely gone out of my life, physically. All right? That's not even 24 hours. The third murder, which is the second incident, okay? I'm in the middle of trying to get my record sealed, right? Thursday night, I killed her. I took off Friday. I didn't go to work. I called in sick, took CTO, all right? Dismembered her body, got rid of her body, but kept her head in her hands because they're identifiable. They're highly identifiable. I kept those at the apartment, okay? That Friday night, Thursday night, I took her. Friday morning, she was dismembered. Friday night, she was disposed of, right? Saturday morning, I left, right? And I wasn't satisfied that I took the head along in the hands, but I couldn't put them someplace that could be sure they would be dug up by an animal or just be somewhere. It's scary going out there trying to bury somebody or dispose of body parts in a community or out even in the boonies where you don't know where you're at and who can come up at any moment. I had some real close calls there where people would come out of nowhere. And if a body's found and they remember this beige-looking car sitting there the night, that's evidence. So it was very, very hard to get rid of this stuff. So anyway, Saturday morning, I went to see the psychiatrist in Fresno. Saturday afternoon, I saw the other one. Saturday evening, I'm with my fiancée and her family over in Turlock. Sunday night, I come back to my apartment.
Ed later spoke of his kills, describing himself as the hunter and the girls as his victims. He likened decapitating his victims to a hunter taking the head of a deer. But he said that there was a sexual thrill in it, and it wasn't about the death, it wasn't about the murdering. A direct quote from Ed is, "Alive, they were distant, not sharing with me. I was trying to establish a relationship, and there was no relationship there. When they were being killed, there wasn't anything going on in my mind except that they were going to be mine." He would go on to eat parts of 2 of his victims to make them a part of him forever, although he did later recant this part of his confession. The day after Ed killed Aiko, he was actually due to appear in front of a panel of psychiatrists as a follow-up for his parole. He turns up, he tells them exactly what they want to hear, and they indicate that they see no reason to consider him a danger to anyone else. It's at this point that they recommend sealing his juvenile records, and he's given a clean bill of mental health. All the while, Ed has Aiko's head in his car, or so it's reported anyway. His next victim is 19-year-old Cynthia Shull on 7th of January 1973. By this point, Ed is living with his mother again, and they're arguing more than ever. He drives Cynthia to a secluded location and kills her quickly, shooting her with a new gun that he just bought earlier that month before taking the body back to his mother's house. He does the same as usual with the body, this time throwing Cynthia's body parts over a cliff, but they soon wash up on a nearby beach. But there are no connections made to Ed. You see, Ed wasn't the only serial killer operating around Santa Cruz at this time. 25-year-old Herbert Mullin had stopped taking his antipsychotic medication, and he was being urged to kill by the voice in his head that told him there was going to be a super earthquake to hit California, and the only way he could prevent it was human sacrifice. Mullin was caught and convicted on 10 counts of murder. His spree started after Kemper and finished before him. So it's not crazy of the Santa Cruz police to have attributed all the bodies appearing to the same person. The thought of 2 serial killers operating in the same area was kind of insane. And yet, it was happening. They just didn't realise it yet. On February 5th, Ed has another huge argument with his mother. This time 23-year-old Rosalind Thorpe and 20-year-old Alice Lou Pay. Now by this point, Ed is back living full-time with his mother in Santa Cruz, whilst his mother worked in administration at the University of California, Santa Cruz. With all of these hitchhiking university students in the area going missing, UCSC had started to urge female students to stop hitchhiking and to only accept rides from cars that had university stickers on them, a mark that this was someone attached to the university and therefore someone who could be trusted. However, Ed had a sticker on his car, as his mother worked at the university and he often picked her up from work. Any girls who got into his car from this point onwards would have felt very safe that they were in good hands. He would even talk to them about the murders that were happening in the area.
You know what we were talking about as we're driving around? Almost as often as not. This guy that's going around doing this stuff. And the second they started talking that, they didn't realize it, but they were getting a free ride. I couldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole, I swear. You know, but they'd be telling me all about this guy, and they're comparing notes and speculating on what he looks like, how he carries himself, why he's doing this stuff, telling me about it.
But when Rosalind and Alice got into the car that day, he shoots them dead whilst they were still on campus. He covers their bodies with blankets and takes them to his mother's house. He beheaded them just outside the house in full view of his neighbours, who just happened to not look over. He disposed of the remains along Highway 1 and Eden Canyon, which were discovered just a week later. In the April, Ed goes out and buys a new gun, one bigger than his .22 caliber handgun, this time a .44 caliber Magnum revolver. His juvenile records had now been expunged, so he had no issues whatsoever walking into a store and buying any gun he wanted. He walks out gun in hand whilst the shop sends a request for a proper background check to the police. This was just standard procedure, but the police were able to see that the person who had bought this gun had a youth record for double homicide. And therefore they knew that they probably should remove this weapon from Ed's possession immediately. And remember that Ed was well known within the policing community. Big Ed was a regular face at the jury room, the gentle giant. But still no one wanted to be the one to go and get his gun off him. He was 6'9" and he was intimidating when he wanted to be. So they literally just draw straws and sent an officer around to collect the gun off Big Ed, who hands it over with little fuss. But this does shake him because he's now absolutely convinced that the police are onto him. Of course they weren't at all, but now Ed's paranoid.
Some police department, now they actually came to your house to pick up a handgun.
Sheriff's representatives. One of the detectives was upset because he heard I had a .44 Magnum pistol and was a convicted man. He came to take the gun away, and it was on he and his sergeant detective. They were staking out the wrong house. It was across the street, and I'm playing around with the car, standing next to the gun in the trunk. They come over and ask me about, excuse me, sir, do you know who lives in this house across the street here? Well, that house was 609 Harriet. He crossed back over to this side into 609 Ord, and they were looking for me and didn't even know that, see what I mean? Bad news. Well, at any rate, we walk into the house to have them ask my mother about this other house, and I'm saying, hey, which 609 are you looking for? And they said, are you Ed Kemper? Yes. And it goes on. And I needed to find out what they were looking for, the murder weapon, the .22 automatic, or the .44 Magnum, and I don't want to advertise that I've got a whole bunch of guns. So I made a comment to divine between the two. And I said, yes, quite a little gun, isn't it? And he retorted, a .44 Magnum, I hope so. And I said, whew, okay, because that loaded .22 was under the front seat and guaranteed me an arrest right on the spot. And .44 was in the trunk. I forgot that. I took him in the house, we went into my bedroom, and the closet doors open, and I have a high-powered rifle with a scope on it.
You had some other stuff in the house too, yes?
Yeah. I had the personal effects and identification of the last two co-eds that had been murdered about 2 months before, right next to the guns in the closet, in a box.
Could he have seen it?
No, but when he arrested me for having all those guns and went through the rest of the closet looking to see if there were any pistols or anything else, he couldn't have helped notice a purse, a book bag, and co-ed ID inside of those belonging to their two latest murder victims. I'd back up and said, oh, excuse me. I just remembered something. And instantly he responds to what I'm saying. My hand moves. Back we go outside, and he's still thinking, boy, this is a really nice and helpful guy here.
So on April 20th, 1973, his crimes culminate in the murder of his mother. This was always going to be where this story ended up. He often killed the hitchhikers out of hatred for his mother. When he killed them, he fantasized about killing his mother. But even for Ed, actually killing Clarnell was one step too far. Until this night, when Clarnell comes home late after a night out drinking with her friends.
It was springtime. It was April. And for 2 months I hadn't killed. And I said, it's not going to happen to any more girls. It's got to stay between me and my mother. And I can't get away from her. We're still fighting. She's still belittling me. I'm like a puppet on a string, and I entertain her. She knows all my buttons, and I dance like a puppet. I knew a week before she died I was going to kill her. And she went out to a party, she got soused, she came home, went to sleep. I was woken up by that. Came out. I walked up to her bed. She's laying there reading a paperback, as many thousands of nights before. And she said, "Oh, I suppose you're going to want to sit up all night and talk now." Shit. And I looked at her and I said, "No." I said, "Good night." And I knew I was going to kill her.
Ed Kemper has spoken about his crimes a lot. He has done a lot of interviews. He even helped the FBI's behavioural science unit with the very definition of what makes a serial killer a serial killer. He never showed an ounce of remorse. Not really. The only time he has ever broken down, the only time he's ever shown emotion, is when he talks about the death of his mother. Ed knew this night that now was the time. His mother had rejected him once again. He waits for her to go to bed and then sneaks back into her room with a claw hammer, and he just beats her to death. But of course her death wasn't quite enough. Ed decapitates Clarnell's body and engages in oral sex with his own mother's dismembered head before placing it on a shelf and using it as a dartboard. He shouts at the head. Everything he's ever wanted to say comes out now. He also removes her larynx and tries to dispose of it in the garbage disposal. I suppose he saw her larynx, her voice, as a symbol of all her hatred towards him. And then he just goes and has a drink at a local bar. But for some reason there still wasn't enough. Maybe he still had the urge to kill. Maybe he's concerned that Clarnell's murder would point straight to him as the culprit. So he calls over Clarnell's friend and neighbour, Sally Hallett, who he immediately strangles upon arrival. He spends the night with Sally's body, and the next morning, Easter Day, he flees the scene in Sally's car. He turns on the radio in the hope of the bodies being on the news. But there's nothing for 3 days. The crimes just simply weren't discovered. Once in Pueblo, some 1,500 miles away, Ed stops at a phone booth and calls the police himself. He didn't want to be on the run anymore. He didn't want to murder anymore. His mother dying was the peak. It's why he killed. And now she was gone. Apparently so was the urge. The police officer he spoke to at the Santa Cruz PD was one of his drinking buddies, someone who knew Kemper well, and this officer thought that Ed was just messing around. He refused to take him seriously when he said that he'd killed his mother, and he actually hangs up on him. So Ed calls back again and he says clearly, "I am the co-ed killer," the name that the media had dubbed him. Now it was clear that Herbert Mullins and the co-ed killings were separate. He tells the police details that only the killer would know, and he stays on the phone with them whilst the police check out Clarnell's house. Sure enough, he's telling the truth, and he stays at the phone booth until the Pueblo police pick him up, and he's driven back to Santa Cruz. On the journey back to Santa Cruz in the car, he tells the officers of all his crimes in glory detail until they're literally begging him to stop.
Why did you wind up giving yourself up?
It had to stop. It had to stop. Once my mother was dead, there's almost a cathartic process at that point. I got physically ill right then, when she died, when I murdered her. And once she was dead, there was no way I could back out. I had backed down from giving up 1,000 times. You know, I just used to get drunk and go sit out in front of the sheriff's department in a parking lot across the street on one of those little concrete parking berms, and I just sit there and say, "No, I still can't." The clanging doors, I could still hear them. No, because it'll never open again. But I look back on that and wish I had earlier, when I was saying those things to myself. The people who were later dead wouldn't be. The regret that came later would have not had to be. Those people, not things, those people would still be with their families, with their loved ones. They would have their own families. If I had had the courage to make that decision, instead of painting myself into the corner.
On May 7th, 1973, Edmund Kemper is formally charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder. Whilst there was no doubt that Ed was the co-ed killer, he had fully confessed everything. Him and his attorney enter a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, which is crazy to think of because he'd just been given a clean bill of mental health just 5 months earlier. And the court-appointed psychiatrists do agree. They eventually find Ed to be sane. Whilst he's awaiting trial, Ed tries to commit suicide twice, but fails. The trial begins on October 23rd, 1973. As I said, he's found to be sane by 3 separate psychiatrists. He spoke clearly and honestly, as far as we know anyway, of his crimes, and he showed a deep understanding of why he did the things he did. He said he killed the victims because he wanted them for myself, like possessions. It was also found that Kemper had begun to enjoy the infamy of being a serial killer. He revelled in the attention from what he did. He took to the stand himself during the trial and spoke of his mental state and why he felt like he had to do the things he did. It was very clear that he was in full control when he committed these murders. There was very little to deliberate in court really, and it was obvious that he was guilty. Once psychiatrists had declared him sane, it really was a no-brainer. The trial lasted for just 3 weeks, and on November 8th, 1973, the jury deliberated for 5 hours before finding him guilty on 8 counts of first-degree murder. Ed hoped to be given the death penalty. He told the judge that he believed he ought to be tortured to death. But unlucky for him, and for everyone else, he was convicted at a time when the Supreme Court had placed a moratorium on capital punishment, and all death sentences were commuted to life imprisonment. The death penalty was only applicable to crimes committed after January 1st, 1974. So instead, Ed sentenced to 7 years to life for each count, with the terms to be served concurrently in the California Medical Facility. Once back in prison, Ed becomes a model prisoner once again. He still is. He's alive in prison to this very day, although he's now considered medically disabled after a stroke. He was actually incarcerated in the same block as Charles Manson and Herbert Mullin, who Ed really hated. He really hated Mullin. He described him as just a cold-blooded killer, killing everyone he saw for no good reason. Ironic, huh? Whilst in prison, Ed said that Herbert would annoy people by singing whilst they were trying to watch TV, so Ed would throw water on Herbert to shut him up. When he behaved, he'd give him peanuts. Quote, Herbie liked peanuts. That was effective because pretty soon he asked permission to sing. That's called behaviour modification treatment. It just goes to show how smart and manipulative Ed Kemper really was, but he was so proud to be that way. He was given a number of responsibilities in prison once again, such as scheduling other inmates' appointments with psychiatrists, and he goes on to learn a great number of new skills. He even dictates audiobooks for the blind and coordinated this project in prison himself. He spent over 5,000 hours narrating these books and has hundreds of recordings to his name. He's been denied parole time and time again. It doesn't matter how much of a model prisoner he is. They fell for that last time when he was in a Atascadero. He was last denied parole in 2017 and isn't eligible again until 2024. He's currently in his 70s. Edmund Kemper really is a fascinating killer to research and to attempt to psychoanalyse. He is so self-aware, so willing to talk about his crimes that it gives a really interesting insight into the minds of serial killers as a whole. In fact, Ed was one of the first serial killers to ever talk to the FBI's behavioural science unit about his crimes. A part of our understanding of serial killers today comes directly from Ed Kemper's interviews with John Douglas and Robert Ressler. Ressler told a story of how when he went to interview Ed Kemper alone for their 3rd meeting, having built a rapport in the previous 2 meetings, they sat in a locked cell for 4 hours. But when Ressler tries to press the button to summon a guard, no one came. Ed must have sensed that Ressler was feeling on edge because he tells him to relax before saying, "If I went apeshit in here, you'd be in a lot of trouble, wouldn't you? I could screw your head off and place it on the table to greet the guards." Ed Kemper liked to play with people. He knew how. He also liked to talk. He talked a lot. The only time he ever showed emotion is when he spoke of his mother. John Douglas ultimately admitted that he liked Ed as a person. He was friendly, open, sensitive, and has a good sense of humour. John Douglas said that it was very easy to forget about all the horrific crimes that Ed had committed, until he starts talking about all of these gory details, which is something he really revelled in. I pondered in a video I made last week about whether serial killers are caused by nature or nurture. In most cases, I believe it to be a mixture of both. If someone is born with a predisposition to violence and then raised in a chaotic, unhappy, abusive environment, they're more likely to act on these inner urges. They're angry at the world. But if someone is born with a predisposition to violence but is raised in a happy, caring environment, they're less likely, although not impossible of course, to grow up and commit the horrific crimes like the ones we've heard of in this video. With Ed Kemper, I feel like he would have been the latter. In fact, I wouldn't even be sure that he was born with any predisposition at all. I think he is almost entirely the result of his mother, a woman who berated him from the time he could talk, domineering and obsessive, who locked him in a basement because she thought he could rape his sisters. A mother who never showed an ounce of love or care, although let's not forget that she did allow him to live with her and would help him out with money all the time. But was this just another form of control? I'm inclined to believe that his mother is a reason Ed ended up doing the things he did, and Ed openly admits this as well. That's not to say I'm passing the blame onto Clarnell. Ed was fully sane and incredibly intelligent and self-aware. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew that murder was wrong. It's just that he may have turned out very differently had he been raised in a loving and nurturing environment. He was incredibly intelligent. Who knows what other more positive things he could have gone and done if he was raised in a happy household. Or maybe he would have ended up being a serial killer anyway. I mean, we'll never really know now. And that's Ed Kemper, a really fascinating serial killer to look into. There are hours and hours of recorded interviews with him available on YouTube, so if you want to go and watch those, I would highly recommend. I'll link a couple of them down below if you want to go and watch. Thank you so much for watching this video. Let me know what serial killer you'd like me to focus on next month, and I'll see you then. Bye guys.